All right, so we're going to formally get started. Welcome to today's session, Improving Academic Success Through Cognitive and Metacognitive Strategy Instruction. My name is Tessie Bailey, and I'm the director of the Progress Center. And I'm joined today with Stacy Hurt, who is our Progress Center Knowledge Development Lead. So Stacy, if you'd like to say hello.
Hi, welcome everyone. Yes, my name is Stacy Hurt and I serve as the lead for the knowledge development team and also a technical assistance provider. So welcome to our session.
And we also have with us Liz Hicks, and Liz has actually joined us as a Progress Center intern. We do one every summer. So if you're interested in being an intern at AIR, please let us know. And Liz, you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, hello everyone. I'm Liz Hicks, joining as a Progress Center intern this summer. And yeah, I'm just excited to be here for Prepping for Progress. Thanks for joining us.
And Liz will be sharing all of the resources in the chat box. But as always, you can find everything that we share today, including the PowerPoint presentation, on the Prepping for Progress webpage. So our outcomes for today are really to define what is executive functioning and really talk about why it's important in the context of education. One of the things that we have found probably in the last decade or two is that most IEPs focus on students' academic goals and academic needs. But IDEA is quite clear that the purpose of the IEP and its proposed aids and services are to help students address academic and functional needs that result from the disability. In fact, in the preamble of the IDEA, you will see reference to executive functioning as one of the areas of functional needs that we need to consider for students with disabilities. We're also going to talk about examples of cognitive and metacognitive strategies. And towards the end, Stacy's going to share some resources and model some of those strategies so that you have some of the knowledge and skills to explicitly teach your students how to use these strategies to address their functional needs that are impacting their academic success. Now, before we get started, and I think a lot of you are already doing that, we want you to think about a time when you had a really complex task. And I think about a group assignment, for example, in college, or maybe it was your first IEP. What were some of those things that you needed to consider, right, in order to complete that task? And how were you able to complete that task? So as you're introducing yourself in the chat box, we'd like you to just share some of the things that you thought about. I think about, for me, it's actually completing the task. I do a good job of getting things started, but trying to figure out the strategies to complete it can be quite challenging. Some of you may struggle with actually starting the task. I have a son who has pretty significant learning disabilities, and I would say starting the task is hard. I know Ellen talked about the current performance data, hard to collect, hard to get the data to really understand what is the nature of that task. Supporting from mentors, getting a realistic sense of the time. Yes, I think that's something we sometimes think things will happen really quickly. And as a result, maybe we overestimate, what's needed or how much time. So as we go through today, we want you to think about, what does it take for a student who sits within your classroom to be able to take the academic instruction and the materials that you're providing, be able to engage in that task and benefit from that task so that they can do better in their academic skills. Part of that, I think you see on here, is managing those distractions, right? So I'm going to share just a quick video, and this really gets at, what does it take to really have executive functioning? Like, how does it work for students? Are you doing your work?
How does executive function develop?
6, 7, and plus 4.
In little children, and even, in the infant and toddler years, you begin to see the roots of executive functioning skills. What's going on in our brains is unbelievably intricate and complicated.
The prefrontal cortex, or the front third of the brain, is important for executive function. But it's more than just prefrontal cortex. This region doesn't act alone. It's involved in controlling your behavior through its interactions with all other parts of the brain. The brain goes from a situation where you've got nearest neurons communicating very strongly with each other and ignoring the rest of the brain, to these widespread networks that are connecting these different areas. Executive function changes over the life course. It improves radically over the first few years.
I got a match prime.
It continues to improve throughout adolescence. It's not until early adulthood that you have the adult-type networks that are very strongly activated that connect different brain regions together.
Let's take notes.
Also, we believe that executive functions can be trained.
It's just like going to the gym. So the more you practice in these areas, the stronger the capacity is likely to become because you're helping to strengthen those neural connections.
Aha! You're at 24.
Slowly but surely, you're going to be able to step back, and that child's going to go into the world with these skills where they can get along with other people, change rules, and they can be flexible, and they can accomplish new things, and they're unafraid.
I got bit by my dog in my arm. Oh dear.
If we don't learn these skills during the childhood and adolescent years when they're coming online, we are really ill-equipped as an adult to hold a job, to maintain a marriage, to raise children, to get along with each other, to basically be part of a civil society.
You're okay.
So the video I just shared is just a portion of a clip that's in one of our learning management system modules around the explicit instruction of executive functioning skills, particularly cognitive and metacognitive strategies. And I was watching in the chat box that a couple of you were putting in what some of those behaviors are, is that ability to sustain attention, focus, the time management. These are these critical skills that as adults, we use on a regular basis to complete our employment tasks, to engage in conversations with our families, to manage our households. And as you heard in the video, these skills develop very early on and require a lot of practice. And for many kids with disabilities, the disability itself impacts one or more of these executive functioning skills. So for example, you think about a student who has attention deficit disorder, and obviously attention is impacted. So if we're not providing that explicit instruction in how to address those attention challenges, then what we're doing is managing that kid's executive functioning deficit, but not helping them develop the skills to be able to address that challenge as they become older. So there are a number of skills that we work on in terms of our work, is helping students address working memory challenges, right? How do they organize? And I think a couple of people mentioned this. How do you manage the task? How do you make sure it's done in a timely period? How do you bring in that information to complete the task in an efficient and effective way? We need to think about this, ways that we ignore some of this irrelevant information, the distracting information that's there. And I think a couple of folks mentioned that as well, that if a student cannot sit in a class and attend to that task because of the distractions that exist, then they're not going to be able to access and benefit from the academic instruction. Cognitive flexibility, you probably see this in your spouse sometimes, is that this shifting from task to task. And if you are in school, you will see that, kids can't spend the entire day working on a single task, that reading instruction ends and math instruction begins. And that requires flexibility, and that we can manage that and provide strategies for students to be able to know when those are. But what we're looking to do is build the kids' executive functioning skills to be more flexible, so that as they become adults, they're much better able to to address shifts in work tasks. Attention, we talked about the planning, is thinking about how do we start task? How do we break that task into something that's manageable and move through it? Think about a large paper you had in college, as well as self-monitoring. Now, some kids develop these skills, as you just saw, sort of naturally. They develop them through play and feedback with their peers and adults. But some students need additional support and practice opportunities to develop these skills. We used to have a lot of this in the way that we designed our Tier 1, where kids, as you saw, will play games and memory strategies. But as we've become more academic focused, we haven't really provided the time and direct instruction for folks to develop those particular skills. So we think about how do we ensure that students can acquire those skills through specially designed instruction, through the general education curriculum that they're getting to fully develop these skills to become productive citizens. And I can see Dan makes an excellent point. Like, we constructed school for students to sit within a classroom for 6 or so hours. I can't do that. I have a child who has pretty significant learning disability, needs to get up and move around. That's how he knows he learns. And so we look for environments that we develop environments that are conducive for our students, not try to fix our students to those environments. So we're talking about 2 different strategies, and one of those is metacognitive strategies. And these are the strategies that we're going to share some examples for that help students become aware of how they think, right? How do they regulate the thinking process to move forward? Part of that is self-talk. Talking myself through, I just need to do this, and then I'm going to do this. Monitoring. So if I'm on a weight loss program, I might be doing that is monitoring the extent to which I'm implementing the things to promote weight loss, as well as my self-management. The other thing has to do with these cognitive strategies. And these are the strategies that really are targeted at the cognitive processing level. These are my ability to set goals, right? To use strategies like mnemonics or graphic organizers to break down more complex tasks or more meaty learning opportunities so that I can use them, not just in that context, but in the long term. Now we have just a short video, and I want to share it. It comes directly from our learning management system module. It's pretty short, but it sort of breaks down what we were just talking about, the differences and how they fit together for cognitive and metacognitive strategies.
Cognitive and metacognitive strategies can help students build executive functioning skills. So, what are they? Cognitive strategies target cognitive processes considered necessary for student success in school, such as memory, attribution, and attention. These mental activities ultimately direct thinking and learning, so cognitive strategies attempt to help students redirect these areas of cognition towards relevant information and appropriate tasks. Some examples of cognitive strategies include setting goals, using mnemonics, and using graphic organizers. Metacognitive strategies are strategies that enable students to become more aware of how they think and how they can independently regulate their cognitive processes. Examples include self-talk, self-monitoring, and self-management strategies. Teaching students with disabilities cognitive strategies may not be enough to ensure that these strategies are implemented successfully or independently. To support students' use of cognitive strategies, teachers compared the teaching of cognitive strategies with metacognitive strategies. This process allows students to see them in context and understand how the strategies can be used and generalized to other tasks and settings.
It's a pretty short video, but does provide sort of this brief introduction to these strategies. And I want to give kudos to some of the folks in the chat boxes. These are relevant for adults as well as teachers. We may have our own goal setting strategies, self-monitoring, self-management. Imagine those of you who are implementing a behavior intervention plan in which the student is that you're monitoring your extent to which you're providing positive feedback versus negative feedback, right? So we do some of that self-monitoring, that self-management as well. I wanted to share a couple of strategies that you probably have been doing, but maybe didn't recognize how important they are. These various strategies, and you think about, what is an effect size? It's about 0.4 is considered about the equivalent of a year's growth if you use Hattie's comparison. But think about these strategies are what are going to help this student learn how to read, right? Part of our job in special ed is to teach the student not just to read or to do math, but to help them develop the skills so they can learn how to read and do math as they move throughout their curriculum. Setting challenging goals, being able to monitor those goals, very large effect. Simple things like help seeking, note-taking, and study skills, mnemonics, and Stacy will share some examples of those. And now you'll look at number 3 is that cognitive task analysis, is really being able to take a much more complex task and break it into manageable parts. And by helping students with disabilities do that, they can apply that to their research paper that they need for language arts, their math test, their history assignment that they have, as opposed to just teaching the student the content necessary to do those activities. Now I'm going to pass this over to Stacy, and she's going to share and model some of these strategies.
Thank you, Tessie. And I love that last slide. It really captures that these are strategies that work, right? So the metacognitive strategies. So over the next couple slides, I will be sharing examples of modeling cognitive and metacognitive strategies and demonstrate where to find some of these examples in our Progress Center briefs. So if you're able, click on the QR code, and Liz, my colleague, is going to drop a link in the chat if you're unable to access to take you to the briefs. So here you'll see that the briefs use a 3-phase cycle for planning, delivering, reviewing, and intensifying individual, small group, and whole group instruction. These briefs are designed to be used as a quick reference guide or a tip sheet, if you will, very similar to what you learned yesterday with SDI, to use with current leaders in the field or your educators. They may also be used to structure conversations for PD, working groups, communities of practice, and coursework. So over the next couple slides, I'm actually going to highlight 5 cognitive and metacognitive strategies, the first being teach goal setting. So what is goal setting? So teach students to identify appropriate and feasible goals for themselves. You'll ask students to identify how they will measure their progress toward meeting goals and help students identify positive motivation for attaining these goals. As an educator, you may set an IEP or other progress monitoring goal for students, but students who set appropriate, feasible goals for themselves and learn to monitor their own progress will help build fluency, executive functioning skills to build the planning, self-monitoring, and attention. So research has also shown that actively involving students in progress monitoring through performance feedback and goal setting can lead to improved academic outcomes. So Liz dropped a link in the chat that will take you to the 6-step instructional routine for engaging students in progress monitoring. And this is just one example. But we've learned that students who are at risk for academic failure and students with disabilities who have their progress monitored weekly and bi-weekly often do not see their own data. So I don't know if you've had this experience with your teachers or in your own classroom, but we kind of get into the routine of collecting data weekly or bi-weekly, but then not going back to it. If one, not even looking at it, but not sharing it with students. So to really get that buy-in and engage our students to build that motivation, we want to share these goals with our students and have them set the goal and track it with us. Strategy 2, teach graphic organizers. So graphic organizers can assist with planning, connecting prior knowledge and new learning, organizing information, and supporting students who struggle with working memory. So there are many different kinds of graphic organizers. This one is just one example from our National Center of Intensive Intervention, or NCII, that analyzes text. So Liz just dropped a link for you to have a more broad example of this feature. But I want to note that we have interviewed schools that are beating the odds for students with disabilities, and one of their key strategies is graphic organizers. They are using organizers for students to access the general education curriculum by creating organizers for just social studies, science, language arts, math, and across the board. So this has really been a key to support our students to access that general education curriculum. And yes, and that link identifies 7 examples. So strategy 3 is another cognitive strategy, and it is teach memory strategies. So use memory strategies that can help support students' retention and recalling information. So these strategies may include using visual cues to break down processes and key steps, or teaching mnemonic strategies. So for an example, to the right, you will see slant. So this is a cue for just a specific action that would be appropriate for the student to take in a classroom. It also cues that word slant as the position of a body of a student engaged or leaning into their own learning. Another example of a mnemonic strategy, next, thank you, is helping students remember content by making connections between their own prior knowledge and new information. So here we've outlined 4 strategies: keyword, peg word, acronym, and acrostic. The first one, keyword, is which a familiar word that sounds similar is used. Second, peg word is just a rhyming word. So it's a rhyming word that's used to represent a new word, fact, or number. The next example is acronym strategy, so in which letters represent the first letter of key information. And the last noted there is acrostic, very similar to the acronym strategy, in which the first letter of each word in a sentence represents the key information. So I'd like you all now I would like to engage you in the chat. Please share one of your own memory strategies that you've used with your students or yourself, or a mnemonic strategy that has either helped you learn or that you have taught your students to learn and access math, language arts, science, social studies. Can you please drop an example in the chat? And I can't see it, so I don't know if Tessie or Liz can unmic to share. I see several coming in. Yep, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. I think that was the classic one. Yes.
Everybody knows PEMDAS, like it's drilled in our
Excellent.
brains. Yeah.
Pamela put cubes in there, but I'm not sure what cubes stands for.
And Roy G. Bave.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So Pamela, if you can share what that is, we'd love to know.
Yeah.
Race.
The race, we saw that one in the last session too, for language arts.
Mm-hmm.
And I think
Oh.
sometimes too, Stacy, it's if students develop their own, that can also be a very helpful strategy, right? So as opposed to us giving it to them, is getting kids to work together to develop those strategies. They engage in the learning and develop their own metacognitive strategy to access that information.
So it looks like cube is circle, underline, box, evaluate, and solve for like a math word problem. That's pretty great.
And as these all come in, if you've heard of high leverage practices, you know there's 22 of them. These 6 briefs, as Tetsi shared the evidence, we have teased out the 6. So metacognitive practices are one of the 6. So we're sharing these strategies with you because they show effects with students, right? They use a strategy, we will increase their academic or behavioral learning. So this next slide, now that we've shared a couple cognitive strategies, we're now going to lean into metacognitive strategies. So these strategies enable students to become more aware of how they think, right? So that thinking about thinking, so they can independently regulate their cognitive processes. So again, we have the QR code and Liz is going to share the link in the chat. Let's look at some examples of metacognitive strategies, including self-management, self-monitoring, and think-aloud strategies. So for our first metacognitive strategy example, I'd like to highlight teach self-management skills. So students who learn to use self-management strategies use behavior change tactics to produce a desired change on their own. As defined by NCII, or the National Center of Intensive Intervention, students are taught self-management strategies as a way to help them take responsibility for their own behavior. Self-management should be used in conjunction with reinforcement strategies, and it's important to have a student focus on appropriate behaviors. So a couple of examples are self-monitoring and self-evaluating. The first, self-monitoring, students record their demonstration of a behavior. And the second, self-evaluating, students evaluate their performance of the behavior against pre-identified expectations. So what is it? So we're drilling it down just a little bit more for you with examples. So what is it? Self-monitoring teaches students to ask themselves questions or record data on a regular basis. So on the left, one example is, you can see it's a self-monitoring tool for an elementary age student to simply assess, are they a good listener? On the right, you can see another self-monitoring tool to assess feelings. The student would ask, how do I feel? And then what do I need to do based on that feeling? So students also may monitor their performance through graphing, such as recording information on daily check-in, check-out forms. Tessie also dropped, I think, a link sharing that 6-step strategy from the tool from earlier.
Yeah, the one we shared earlier with the progress monitoring has a self-evaluation component in it. While the teacher might collect the progress monitoring data, it's getting students to self-evaluate using that collected progress monitoring data.
So here, we're now going to look at a 2-minute clip of self-monitoring in action.
In this video, an elementary school student uses metacognitive strategies while solving an addition problem. More specifically, he uses self-instruction and a self-monitoring checklist to guide himself through the problem-solving process. By doing so, he actively plans and monitors his work.
I can't figure out what 3 plus 5 is. What is it? Well, let me look at my checklist. First, it says read the problem. The problem says 3 plus 5. So I've checked that. Now it says, my checklist says, what is the problem asking? It is asking me to add 3 plus 5. Now to draw a picture. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now it says, does my drawing match the problem? Up here it says 3 plus 5, so down here it says 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now I have to solve it. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. The answer to 3 plus 5 is 8.
So I love that clip. It's powerful. It's short, 2 minutes. Feel free to share that with your teachers or classroom teachers. Share it with your students so they can see what it looks like to self-monitor. Next step is self-evaluation. What is it? Students use information they collect through self-monitoring or data collected by a teacher to evaluate how they are doing. So to the right, you will see an example of a self-evaluation recording form used for behavior. So this self-evaluation form example can be used for a teacher-student conference outlining positive and negative behaviors aligned with positive and negative consequences. You will find, if you have not already, and please drop yes or you agree in the chat, that students tend to be harder on themselves than we are with them. This has been my own experience and also coaching teachers when I have them evaluate their own instructional practices. And when I go in and observe, teachers and students are often harder on themselves when they self-evaluate. But it does get the mind more intentional of what they are doing if you can activate those metacognitive pieces. I think a lot of agree. So now we're going to roll into the last step, strategy 5. Model and teach think-aloud strategies. A think-aloud strategy is just what it sounds like. It is when a student says aloud what they are thinking as they read, solve mathematical problems, or complete other tasks. So what are some examples of this strategy in practice? So feel free to drop in the chat if you use think-alouds in your classroom, but we are going to watch a video that's going to model the think aloud strategy. So again, these strategies can help students access prior knowledge and effectively solve problems, self-monitoring, and more. And thank you, Liz.
Claire has 6 red water balloons, 5 blue water balloons, and 4 green water balloons. How many blue and green water balloons does she have in all? All right, so the question is asking me how many blue and green water balloons in all. I'm going to underline the question and circle blue and green water balloons to remind me of what I'm being asked to do and so that I don't forget the label for my answer. Next, I look back at the problem and I see there are 5 blue and 4 green balloons. I don't need the information about red balloons because the question doesn't ask me about them, so I'll cross that out so it doesn't confuse me. The question asked me how many blue and green balloons in all, so I know I need to add 5 and 4. If I start with 5 and count 4 more on my fingers, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, I get 9, so my answer is 9. Now it's time to label my answer. I'm looking back at the question and I see that I circled blue and green water balloons because that's what the question asked about, so I know that's my label.
So I know it's very common in math to walk through the problem. So you may not use this video clip in your classroom, but do as you go through instruction, talk through aloud what you are thinking with your students so they can see and hear what it looks like.
I will say that if you are looking for math, the National Center on Systemic Improvement has about 40 of these videos specifically for math at various levels of, grade levels and skills. But you can also create your own. I want to point out something that we saw in the last session, Stacy, and it was about that this strategy might seem distracting if all the kids are talking within the classroom. And so some of the schools were saying, we don't allow this talk aloud because it's distracting. But it might be good to pair students up where one student is observing another talk through the strategy and vice versa. And that way they're getting those opportunities for both the practice of that skill and then feedback from their peer and how they approach that skill through their talk aloud.
Oh, excellent. Great example. So this little graphic that's been weaved throughout, you will see on the briefs, but just notice that that first step there highlights the cognitive and metacognitive strategy instruction. It requires planning. So to have a plan in place, not to, go into instruction cold, but to be very methodical about the plan of implementing these cognitive and metacognitive strategies. Second, highlights delivery of instruction, and this should include modeling and practice, giving your students feedback as they practice these think-alouds or self-monitoring any of these strategies, but to actually practice what it looks like. And third, facilitate generalization of the strategy use. So not just to use in one subject area, but to weave it in throughout the day, multiple areas and environments and contexts. The teacher should continually review the student's response to the strategy and consider adaptations. So here we're going to highlight mastery, maintenance, and generalization. So mastery is simply being systematic and explicit. So we talked about teaching the skill, right? Then modeling and practicing. So for students to build that self-efficacy and fluency of these strategies. And third, generalization of the strategy, scaffolding supports in new environments. Now we just have a couple questions for you. First one being, and please drop in the chat, yes or no, we provide accommodations to help kids with executive function issues. Isn't that enough? Yes or no? And any thoughts if you have some on why it isn't enough? Okay, seeing lots of no's. Right, it isn't enough. And it really goes back to that last slide of mastery, maintenance, and generalization. For kids to build that efficacy and confidence with strategies, they really need multiple practice opportunities. Question 2, will cognitive and metacognitive strategies instruction be documented in the IEP? Yes or no? And if yes, how? So would cognitive and metacognitive strategies instruction be documented in the IEP? Yes or no? And if yes, how?
I like that Ellen said yes, they're going to be documented in the PLAF, and that's where you're going to identify what are the strategies that students needs. Where else might you find that instruction documented?
Present levels, the PLAF, the goal strategy, goals. Great. And really it can be threaded throughout, through the PLAF, the goals. Excellent.
And I would, and I would say more importantly, this needs to be included in your specially designed instruction, because if you identify it as a disability related need in your PLAF and you have a functional goal, then students need to be explicitly taught. And that needs to be outlined as a content adaptation for teaching cognitive and metacognitive strategies, as well as where you might be embedding those, whether they're in special education classroom or in the general education classroom. So that's where Mitch says on that service page.
Excellent. 3, where and when should these strategies be taught? So we often hear, we do not have a strategies class. So where and when should these strategies be taught? I'm seeing everywhere.
I like that Ellen said everywhere, because every student could benefit from them, right?
Yep, and I think that was mentioned earlier. Yes, and all students can benefit throughout the day, all settings. Excellent. So any other questions before we move into resources? Yes, throughout the day. So any other questions regarding metacognitive or cognitive strategies or the instructional briefs? Okay.
All right. So thank you, Stacy. And I just want to echo what everyone has indicated. I mean, part of our job in special ed is to address the disability related needs. And if you think about disabilities, there's a reason, something about the disability that prevented the child from accessing and progressing in the general education instruction in the first place, right? So it's not that we're just teaching kids how to read or how to do math. Part of our role with our IEP is to also teach kids how to learn to read, to do math. And so these metacognitive and cognitive strategies really give kids the skills necessary to be effective and efficient learners so they can access and progress in the general curriculum. We're going to share some resources. You'll see some of these coming in the chat box. We shared the strategy brief. This is one of 6 that were identified through a meta-analysis of high leverage evidence-based practices. Everything that we've talked about today is reflected in this particular brief, although more of that has been embedded within our module that we have that's free, publicly available to folks. It has some of the videos that we shared today, as well as a webinar that really dives into where does this practice fit within the broader practices that Stacy mentioned, right? It's not just about providing the strategy, it's planning for instruction around the strategy, delivering that strategy instruction, and reviewing and intensifying as needed. And I think, as most of you mentioned, it's not really the responsibility of the special educator to teach these strategies. In reality, it's part of our general curriculum across all of our content areas that's accessible to all students. What we do in special education is really provide some of that disability, student-specific instruction to help an individual student master these strategies, be able to generalize those strategies to other settings, and maintain that skill as they progress through their schooling. We hope that you'll continue to follow us. We do know that this focus on cognitive and metacognitive strategies is a growing area within the field. It's been embedded within the regulations as part of the PLAS statement, as you all mentioned, functional goals, as well as our specially designed instruction and supplementary aids and services. But as we start to develop IEPs that are intended to help students experience school success, graduate, and ultimately be able to experience post-school outcomes such as employability, college success, trade school success, or other independent living, they need to develop these functional skills. And as we saw in the video at the very beginning, they take time. They start very early on as kids are toddlers, and we provide these multiple exposures throughout their schooling to be able to develop these skills in a way that they're more independent. So please follow us to learn more about that. You can join our mailing list. We'll be sharing new resources as they come about. But we want to just say thank you for joining us. We have about a minute or two, so feel free to include any of your questions or comments within that. And if you'd like to continue the conversation after today's session, just know that you can use the chat box in the lobby, and we'll continue to share some of the resources and strategies that we use. So thank you all. Thanks, Stacy and Liz. And we look forward to talking with you.